This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Anyone paying attention to the news coming out of Iraq in March 2004 could not have missed it. While the public was becoming accustomed to seeing grisly images from the war on their TV screens, this scene was different. In the little town of Fallujah, pitted within the confines of the infamous Sunni Triangle, the charred remains of two Blackwater employees hung lifelessly over a bridge that straddles the Tigris and the Euphrates River. There's a general sense of outrage coming from both sides of the political aisle. Those on the right were talking about the savagery of the Al-Qaeda insurgents responsible, while more progressive voices argued that the U.S. should not have occupied Iraq in the first place. The third voice that arose from the cacophony was the voice of the average citizen, asking why the U.S. government had contractors on the battlefield. At the time, the image of a contractor that popped in most people's head was that of a burly, middle-aged man in a hard hat. Now that these two men had been killed in combat, military contractors were making the front page of the New York Times. The events that unfolded at Blackwater Bridge surfaced an industry that has remained under the political radar for quite some time. The American military has relied on private contractors in combat since the Revolutionary War, but only in the last 5 years has this industry received some serious scholarly attention. Because of the idea of privatization and outsourcing can be somewhat ambiguous, I will define it generally as any service that the Pentagon contracts out to a private company. These services include, but are not limited to, construction of military hardware, logistics, training, and even combat services. The purpose of this presentation is to put the phenomenon in a historical context while also looking at how the U.S. government relies on privatization to satisfy public opinion. In order to understand how these shifts came about, we need to investigate the history of U.S. foreign policy from the end of the Cold War to the early 1990s. In the interest of time, I'm going to make several key assumptions as a foundation for my argument. These assumptions can be more thoroughly discussed and or disputed during the question and answer time. The first assumption is that American foreign policy during the Cold War was dominated by a strategy of primacy. In this context, primacy is defined as a superiority in the economic, military, and technological and cultural dimensions of power. Primacy was a key means to project American power around the globe, and it also served to restrict Soviet access to strategic military bases on land and at sea. By maintaining a preponderance of power, the United States can ensure that no other nation would fall to communism. And this is best understood by the work of some prominent social scientists such as Melvin Leffler, Christopher Lane, and William C. Woolforth. The second assumption is that American public opinion matters in the formation of foreign policy. As our friend H.W. Brand says at the University of Texas, all politics is local. Political science observes that public opinion is moderate and largely rational. In times of war or lead up to war, Bruce Jenelson of Duke argues that overall the public is neither trigger happy nor gun shy. Regardless of the information level of the public, they directly influence their government through voting in federal elections. Elections allow politicians to know the pulse of the public and will respond accordingly when public opinion disagrees with government decisions. In this way, the public serves as a moderating influence. In order to gain a majority of votes, politicians must moderate their policies to attract the largely uncommitted independent voter. The end of the Cold War saw a fundamental shift in the way American government viewed foreign policy. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the world was no longer structured around two global superpowers. In the immediate aftermath, the United States was left victorious and questioning what next. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. policymakers were at odds trying to discern a new geopolitical cartography. In the midst of this historic victory, foreign policymakers and critics were at their wits' end trying to discern what or who would be the next big threat to American hegemony. This roadmap would not only discern what new competitors would rise to challenge U.S. interests, but also what role America would play in this post-Cold War system. In addition to the absence of an identifiable threat, there was a lack of strategic purpose at the Pentagon. Proponents of U.S. hegemony argued that the military should be used for heavy lifting, that is, fighting major and regional conflicts instead of wasting time escorting kids to kindergarten. Involving U.S. military and humanitarian intervention and peacekeeping would only undermine the readiness should the next big conflict come along. Prominent people at the Pentagon, such as General Colin Powell, supported this approach. Multilateralists argued that the U.S. faced no global competitor, and America could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to the conflict and suffering in the world. By involving itself in regional conflicts and humanitarian work, the nation would bolster its reputation as a benevolent hegemon. By working through international institutions, the United States could gain legitimacy for its policies while simultaneously serving the national interest. This argument is perfectly summed up by the statement of Ambassador to the United Nations, the Ambassador Madeleine Albright, when she said to Colin Powell, "What's the point of having the superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it?" Public opinion in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War can be defined by three metrics. The first is that public opinion supported the idea of America remaining an unchallenged global superpower. Since the beginning of the Cold War, public opinion polls reveal that a majority of citizens support the idea of American primacy overseas. These statistics remained strong after the Cold War, showing that most respondents didn't want American primacy to shrink now that the Soviet Union had collapsed. Even today, public support for U.S. internationalism remains high, even though we're tied down in two simultaneous wars in the Middle East, and the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran appears more imminent than ever. The second metric involves fiscal spending. With the end of the Cold War, most Americans were wary of spending too much of their national treasure on the wars. Worn down by the Reagan defense buildup of the 1980s, most people wanted to decrease defense spending well below Cold War levels. This is somewhat ironic considering the fact that most people have no idea what the federal budget is, yet alone what the defense budget accounts for. In a poll conducted by Rasmussen in 2008, only 24% of respondents knew the correct total of the federal budget, which was $3.1 trillion at the time. Other answers range from $3 billion to $300 trillion. Regardless of public ignorance in budgetary matters, they still have considerable leverage in how much the government spends. This was most recently demonstrated by the vigorous debate around the allocation and spending of TARP stimulus funds. The third metric is that most citizens were wary of sacrificing American lives in combat operations. In other words, they feared spilling blood of our troops in wars they did not fully support. The Vietnam War is largely the thing for American people's casualty phobia. Since the 1970s, the American people have been wary of sending U.S. troops overseas if they did not see the mission as vitally important to the prospect of victory. Evaluating public opinion during the Reagan administration shows that support for sacrificing U.S. lives dropped considerably from pre-Vietnam levels. In order to respond to these three metrics, both the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton formed corresponding policies. The first was that both administrations propped up the idea of American primacy. George Bush argued this idea during a speech in September 1990, when he said the United States was beginning to form a new world order. During Bill Clinton's administration, popular sentiments regarding primacy also rose. Instead of arguing for U.S. hegemony, Clinton wanted America to play a leading role in international institutions like the United Nations or NATO. Though these commitments were multilateral in nature, they still represented primacy because they stressed the importance of American leadership in the world. To respond to the public's concern over spending treasure, both administrations endorsed the idea of a peace dividend. In the Bush Senior administration, Richard Cheney expressed this idea, explained this plan to lower the defense budget in a famous speech to the Senate Armed Services Committee. In it, Cheney explained that at the conclusion of the Cold War allowed the United States to cash in the long-awaited peace dividend. At the end of the Bush presidency, military manpower decreased by 30%, and the funds for procurement decreased by $22 billion. Under Clinton, Secretary of Defense Aspin conducted a full-scale evaluation of the Pentagon entitled the Bottom-Up Review. In 1993 report, he concluded that military readiness must be maintained, but the nation could afford an additional 30% cut to the base force. At the end of the Clinton years, the defense budget remained the same as it was during the Bush Senior presidency, but manpower further decreased from 1.7 to 1.3 million. Finally, to appropriately respond to public concerns over bloodletting, both Bush Senior and Clinton delivered a series of bloodless wars. These conflicts were overwhelmingly low casualty. During the entirety of the Bush presidency, the military sustained under 200 combat fatalities in operations ranging from the invasion of Panama to the first Iraq War. Under Clinton, a series of humanitarian interventions delivered several key PR victories while keeping public concerns over blood at bay. At the end of the Clinton presidency, only 100 military lives had been lost in combat. The attitude of public opinion, along with these three corresponding government policies, led to the formation of a potent myth. This myth proposed that the U.S. government could expand its status as a sole superpower while simultaneously reducing its defense budget and manpower. The bloodless wars of the 1990s further supported the notion that foreign policy could be done on the cheap. They also served to mutually reinforce the metrics we discussed earlier by making the public even more sensitive to cost and blood and treasure. Before evaluating the impacts of this myth in the global war on terror, we need to spend some brief time looking at Clinton's intervention in Kosovo. This case study reveals how effective the myth of American empire was in the American people. It also serves as a foundation for several more disturbing trends that fulminated during Americans' interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. In March 1999, Clinton committed U.S. forces to intervene in the unfolding humanitarian case in Kosovo. Operation Allied Force began a 78-day-long bombing operation that resulted in the expulsion of Soviet forces from Kosovo and a UN peacekeeping mission in the region that still exists to this day. The first shift involved outsourcing military air-powered munitions technology. The advent of the B-2 stealth bomber was perhaps the greatest weapon NATO forces had at their disposal. Construction of the B-2 was outsourced to Northrop Grumman and subcontracted to Boeing Aerospace. B-2's combat debut was on March 24, 1990, the first day of bombing operations. Interestingly enough, civilian avionics engineers maintained the B-2 out of Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. This is the first time aircraft were both constructed and maintained solely by civilian defense contractors. This represents our first shift in the use of privatization in combat. A second fundamental shift was the extent to which private contractors were used on the battlefield, providing logistics, training, and combat support. During the Gulf War, the ratio of contractor to soldier was roughly 1 to 30. In Kosovo, this figure drops to 1 in 10. In addition, Kosovo marks the first time contractors are used as a force replacement instead of a force modifier. Previously, contractors worked alongside military forces, but in Kosovo, contractors were chosen as a replacement for American ground troops during the post-air campaign peacekeeping operations. Former Halliburton subsidiary Kellogg Braun and Root was the largest support firm in Kosovo. KBR was responsible for providing the lifeblood to NATO, including meals, water supply, and laundry services. The Department of Defense awarded KBR the coveted Balkan support contract, which paid the company roughly $500 million for their services over 2 years. With these funds, KBR paired up with the Army Corps of Engineers to build and maintain 2 of the largest military bases in the Balkans. In the end, NATO commanders were pleased with KBR's services, and one such commander stated that KBR was their colleague in promoting peace. In the immediate aftermath of Operation Allied Force, PMCs were also contracted to aid in peacekeeping. In 1998, a Virginia-based firm named DynCorp was awarded a contract to provide a force of 150 personnel to join the UN mission in Kosovo. The purpose of this force was to create a stable environment for the Serbs to exit and ethnic Albanians to return to their homes. Because President Milosevic refused armed UN monitors, the Clinton administration decided to outsourcing the job to private sector. The DynCorp team consisted of a diverse cadre of weapons inspectors, verification experts, drivers, and vehicle technicians. While not serving in direct combat roles, DynCorp personnel provided oversight in the population transfers occurring and in around Kosovo's capital, Pristina. The final observable shift in Kosovo was the expense of the war. During the course of 3-month air operations in the immediate aftermath, $8 billion in costs were incurred. This is primarily due to the cost of the production and maintenance of the B-2 bomber, as well as contracting costs devoted to KBR. The shift is significant because it marks the most expensive contracting operation in the United States history at the time. The global war on terror has only increased America's reliance on battlefield contractors. At the start of Operation Allied Force in Afghanistan, as much as half of the Pentagon's budget was devoted to paying over 1 million contracts. In both these theaters, private contractors slightly outnumbered U.S. military personnel. Calculating casualty figures for contractors is difficult because they're not reported under DoD statistics. The best way to calculate these numbers is evaluating the Department of Labor's life insurance claims. One estimate puts the number of contractor fatalities at 1,500 with over 15,000 wounded. Furthermore, because there's no uniform reporting procedure for government contracts, adding up costs is nearly impossible. The Congressional Budget Office estimates from fiscal year 2001 to fiscal year 2008, the Pentagon has paid over $106 billion in private contracts. Oversight of these contracts is shoddy. Only one government auditor accounts for every $2 billion in contracts. GWAT has shown us that privatization is no longer a successful mechanism for hiding or reducing costs in blood and treasure. With the election of Barack Obama less than 1 year ago, little has changed. It's true Blackwater USA has lost its contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan and was dissolved in 2008. However, like the phoenix of ancient mythology, Blackwater's re-emerged earlier this year under the name Z. In Z's place and countless other private firms, Companies like DynCorp and Triple Canopy play the same role as Blackwater but have a lower profile in the public eye. The simultaneous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have stretched our forces to the brink, and the public is beginning to realize that being a superpower requires some level of sacrifice. The question is not should the U.S. hire private contractors in combat, but rather should the U.S. continue to believe the myth that it can build an empire without shedding blood or treasure. Finally, we all must ask ourselves, in the words of George Clemenceau, if war is indeed too important to be left to the military. Thanks for your time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.